Hello and welcome to another Python lesson from Programming to Success. Today, we will be looking at functions and modules in Python. Before we start, let's have a quick review of what we learned in our last video. We looked at what loops are in Python, and we talked about for loops, while loops, nested loops, and infinite loops. We also learned how to use break statements in our code to completely stop a program's execution. Now, without further ado, let's get on with today's lesson. Chapter 1. Functions. Just like loops, which we covered in our previous video, functions are a way to make coding faster. With functions, we can reuse a piece of code again and again. A function has three parts, which are a name, parameters, and a body. This is an example of creating a function. When we create our function, we first have to start off with the def keyword. Def is just short for define. Whenever we create functions, we always have to start off with this word. After the def keyword, we specify the name of our function. Just think of a function as something that can do a certain job. When we create a name for a function, it should somewhat relate to what the function's job is. After the name, inside of parentheses, we specify the parameters. We can have one parameter, two parameters, as many as we like. We don't even have to have any parameters. A parameter is a variable that only exists inside of that one function. So, when we specify parameters, we are just giving the function something to work with ahead of time. After our parameters, we close our parentheses and finish off with a colon. And then in the next line, we have our body or the code inside of the function. Whenever this function is called, this code will be executed. So we don't need to write the same piece of code again and again. We can just call that function in whenever we want in that program. Functions continue. We can run our function by calling its name later on in the code. Whenever we call a function's name, it will execute the code inside of it. So this is how we will call a function. We first have to specify the name of the function that we are calling, and then in parentheses, the values we want to pass to the parameters. We only need to pass values to a parameter if we have any parameters. If we have 0 parameters in our function, we don't need to put anything here. A parameter is a variable. So when we pass a value to a parameter, we are basically just storing something inside of a parameter. So if one of our parameters here is a variable, the value we specify over here will be stored inside of the parameter. We use commas to specify our parameters and our values. Creating our first function. Now let's create a function that is called a name. The parameters will be first name and last name. Then the function will print out hello, first name, comma, last name. When we call our function, we will specify the values stored inside of the parameters, first name and last name. So, let's try this out in an IDLE file. Things will become a little more clear. So, first, whenever we create a function, we have to start with the define keyword. So, we can say def, and then the name of our function, in this case, it's called name. So, name. And our parameters. What are our parameters? It's first name and last name, because we want Python to print out hello, the first name, and the last name. So we can say first name, and we have to separate the parameters with a comma. So first name, comma, last name. We close our parentheses and finish off with a colon. Python will automatically indent the next line of code for us. Now we want Python to print out hello, and then our first name and last name. We will specify what the first name and last name is when we call our function later on. So, to do this, we would say print hello, and then %s, and then a percent, first name, comma, last name. If you are wondering what this %s is and this % is, don't worry, this %s is just a placeholder for a string. So when we specify the values for first name and last name, those values will be replaced with this %s. So we will get hello and the values we specify for first name and last name. These are just placeholders. And then we say % outside of the quotes, and then the two things that we want to be replaced with this later on. These are just placeholders and nothing complicated. Now, the next step is, if we want our function to actually execute the code, we have to call the function. So, to call our function, we have to specify the name. So, in this case, our function's name is name. And now we need to pass some values to these parameters because we have parameters in our function. We have to pass values to it. So we have to pass values to be the first name and the last name. And based on what we give, Python will print out hello and then what we give here. So let's just say for our first name, we can have George. And then for our last name, we can have Robertson. Now if we run this code, hello George Robertson will be printed out. This is because we specified these values over here, George and Robertson, when we called our function. So when Python saw this call over here, Python went back up to this function, replaced George with first name, and replaced last name with Robertson. So it was basically George, Robertson. They were just replaced. So later on, when we printed them out, George was stored inside of first name and Robertson was stored inside of last name. And we used placeholders here to bring into this sentence what's stored inside of these two values. And first name, George was stored inside of it. So in this first %s was replaced by George. So we got hello George. And Robertson was stored inside of last name. So in the second %s, Robertson was replaced with that. So we got hello George Robertson as a sentence printed out back to us. Return statements. Return statements can be used at the end of a function, and it just returns the result of an expression following the return statement. This is how we create a return statement. We say return and then the expression. The result of that expression will be returned to us. So when we call the function, the result of the expression will be replaced with the function call statement. Then we can print it out for the result to be displayed on the shell using a return statement. So let's create a function called math and make it add two integers together. Then let's have it return the sum back to us. So we first have to start off with the define keyword and then the variable name, or the function name, which is math, and then our parameters. In this case, they are integer 1 and integer 2 because we are adding those two together. And we want Python to return the sum of these two integers. So we would say return integer 1 plus integer 2. So now when we call this function, we can say the variable name or the function name, which is math, and then our values, 5 and 10. Let's just say they're 5 and 10. So 5 will be replaced with integer 1, and 10 will be replaced with integer 2. So Python will return the sum of those, which is 15. Now, 15 will be replaced with the function call statement, which is this over here. So we will get 15 replaced here. However, if we want 15 to be printed out on the shell, we need this to be inside of a print statement. Now if we run this code, we'll get 15. Scope of variables. As I said earlier, variables created inside of a function cannot be used later on in your code because it only exists in that function. This is known as scope. If we try and use a variable created inside of a function, again later on in our code outside of the function, we will get an error saying it is not defined because the variable is out of its scope. So let's try printing out integer 1 outside of the function. We'll get an error saying it's not defined because it's out of its scope. Python does not know what integer 1 is outside of the function. However, if we create a variable outside of a function, that variable can still be used inside of a function. Variables created inside of a function and variables created outside of a function have different scopes from each other. Python built-in functions. Python has many built-in functions that we can use, which is one of the reasons why Python is a really amazing language to learn as a beginner. So we don't have to create our functions every time from scratch. Python has some functions pre-made for us. Some built-in functions that we have been using in our previous videos are the range function, which we used with loops, and the str and int functions, which we use to convert things to strings and integers. Also, the input function, which we use to allow the user to respond to things like questions. Well, that will be it for Chapter 1 functions, and let's get on with the next chapter of today's video. Now let's get on with Chapter 2 of today's lesson. Chapter 2, Modules. Modules in Python are used to combine things like functions into larger programs. Python has some built-in modules, for example, the time, random, and sys modules. However, if we just start using functions from a module, Python will not know what we are talking about. For Python to understand what we are doing, we have to bring in that module into our code. We do that with import statements. Let's try to import the time module. We have to do this if we want to use functions from that module, or else Python won't be able to access the module. To import a module, you just say import and then the module's name. In this case, it's time. So let's open an IDLE file and import the module. Import time. Now we can freely use functions that are a part of this time module because Python will be able to access it because we imported it. So one function that is a part of the time module is the askTime function. It basically just returns the current time back to us. To call this function, we just say time.askTime and then open and close parentheses. When we say time.askTime, we are saying use the askTime function that is a part of the time module. And Python will be able to access the time module because we imported it. However, if we want Python to display the result, the current time, back to us, we have to put this inside of a print statement. So now let's run this code over here. We'll get Monday, August 10th, 15:43:36, 2020. The current time was returned back to us. Sys Module. The Python built-in Sys module is short for system, and it is a way to ask the user to enter a value, just like input statements. Well, first to start off, we have to import the Sys module. So we can do this by saying import sys. Then inside of the sys module, there is an object called stdin, which means standard input. We will learn about objects later. The stdin object has a function called Readline, which is used to read text typed in by the user. It will only read once you have pressed the enter key. So, for example, if we say print sys.stdin readline, we are just giving Python what to access here, the readline function inside of the stdin object inside of the sys module. We separate it by dots. And then an open close parentheses, and we close our print statement parentheses. Now, when we run our code, it will allow us to type in something. Whatever we typed in will be returned right back to us because Python read what we typed in once we pressed the enter key and returned it back to us because of the print statement we used here. Using sys.stdin.readline. Let's create a function called old or young with no parameters. Then we will ask the user to type in how old they are. If they are over 20, we will say they are old. If not, we will say they are young. We will do this completely with the sys.stdin.readline module. So we can keep sys imported, and then we have to define our function. We first say the keyword def, and then our function name. In this case, it's old or young. And then open close parentheses. Because we don't have any parameters, we can leave this empty, and our colon. Python will automatically indent the next line for us, and we can type in print, what is your age? And then in the next line, we can say age, assignment operator. We're creating a variable called age, and then int sys.stdin.readline. So this is basically just saying whatever the user types in response to this, Python will read that with this sys.stdin.readline function and convert that to an integer. Then Python will store that integer inside the variable we created, which is age. Just put a question mark there. Next, we need to check if they are old or young, and we do this with if statements, which we learned in one of our previous videos. We can say if age is greater than 20, print you are old. And then we can say else print you are young. If we want this function to be run, we have to call the function. So we have to leave this function and we have to call it. We do this by specifying the function's name, which is old or young. And then we just have a parentheses here. We don't need to pass any values because this function has no parameters. So if we run this code, Python will first ask, what is your age? If we say 10, you are young will be returned back to us. That's because 10 is less than 20. So Python went inside the else statement and executed print you are young. However, if we say something like 30, you are old will be printed out because Python, this Boolean expression was true, so Python went inside the if statement and executed this code. Well, now you know how to create and use functions in your code. And we covered the basics of modules and some built-in Python modules. With functions and modules, we will be able to write more advanced programs. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, please let me know down below in the comments. Again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.